Hello, everybody.
And action.
God. Hello, everybody, and welcome to English 332. I am your host, Professor Matt Cohen, and this, my friends, is the birth of the American novel. I am sure...
And action.
Do any of you have brothers? Or did you kill them and bury their bodies where nobody would find them? I'm sure you all know plenty about Nathaniel Hawthorne, thanks to being subjected to the Scarlet Letter in high school. Oh, I know what I was saying. I don't know why anybody would ask high school students to read the Scarlet Letter. It's like one of the naughtiest books ever. You go back and read it now and you're like, I can't believe they let me read this.
Frothy.
Sorry. Thanks to being subjected to the Scarlet Letter, you're scarred for life. Hawthorne. Oh, on your PowerPoint, which I know you've pulled up by now, you will see my office hours on the first slide. Contact me. Come and see me. On the second slide, you'll find a photograph of Nathaniel Hawthorne that you can gaze at longingly while I read to you about his life. Hawthorne was from the town of Salem, where Hobomok was set, you remember? He was a middle-class descendant of Puritan forebears who took part in the Salem witch trials and who was haunted by, but also fascinated by, that history. He became a writer, apparently, as my brother tells me, after 12 years of living in his mom's house, which just goes to show, A, that what they say about millennials can apply to some of the greatest writers of classic American literature, and B, which, considering I'm speaking from my parents' house right now, gives me hope about my future. Like many writers at the time and before, he sought a political appointment, since it was very hard to make a living as a writer, and having had the good luck to befriend Franklin Pierce, that's right, that's the President Franklin Pierce, in college at Bowdoin, I'm telling y'all, network now. He managed to get a couple of offices out of his work with the Democratic Party, including a position in the Customs House in Massachusetts. That job he lost to a political competitor after not too long, but he turned it to good use in the opening essay of the Scarlet Letter, which you probably have forgotten by now, and it's hard to blame you. However, waste not, want not, Hawthorne's Puritan ancestors would have said. Eventually, however, he did make a living through his fiction writing. Now today, I want to offer you some of the bigger context for the Blithedale romance, which I have assigned in part because it raises a number of key contextual and even more formal questions, and in part because it's kind of a cool paradox. It's an utterly uncharacteristic novel for Hawthorne in many ways. You probably noticed it's very different from the Scarlet Letter. Yet for that reason, it's much more in touch with broader events and trends in the United States of his time, so it gives us a little more of contact with that era. Our big topics today are these: Utopia, which we've talked about a couple times before, we're going deep today; Transcendentalism, which we're not going to go too deep on because I can't stand it; upheavals in the literary marketplace and gender politics; young America in literature; the peculiarities of Hawthorne's style. We have a lot to do. We start with the oddest part of this whole story: Hawthorne's involvement with the Brook Farm communal living experiment, a socialist utopia that was established in 1841. Utopian enthusiasm swept the United States in the early 1800s. It came hot on the heels of a major national resurgence of religious feeling that saw so many conversions it came to be known as the Second Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening had happened a century earlier. Are we going to survive whatever just happened in there?
Let's keep it down out there.
Trying to do something here. Educational. Why couldn't they have come up with a better name for the Second Great Awakening? I suppose the next one will be called the Third Great Awakening. Anyway, Utopia literally means no place or non-place. It's a word for an ideal community, freed either from some particular problem seen as the root of all evil of society, or from the bureaucratic constraints on an imagined ideal human existence. The word was coined by a British writer named Thomas More in the title of his book, Utopia, way back in 1516. Now, we have seen utopianism represented kind of cynically already in Hobomok, right? A Christian utopian settlement for Puritans fleeing religious oppression in the Old World. But there, Child was at pains to show that even out of a Christian communism, a more democratic, sympathetic society could be founded. Utopia for Child doesn't simply arrive on its own, right? It takes debate, it takes work, it takes conflict. The utopianism of the early 19th century was sometimes religious, but often it involved a kind of socialism. And by describing how people would live if everyone adhered to a particular kind of ethic, utopianism does three things. It inspires the oppressed to struggle and sacrifice for a better life. Somebody out there can imagine what it would look like, and I can believe in it and fight for it. It gives a clear meaning to the aim of whatever its political orientation is, socialism in the case of Brook Farm. There's a little picture of it there on your PowerPoint. And it also demonstrates how this political orientation is ethical, that the precepts of, for example, socialism could be applied without excluding or without exploiting anyone. The problem with utopian socialism, it has been observed, is that it does not concern itself with how to get to that ideal state. It presumes that the power of its own vision is sufficient, and it's not worried about the purity of the motives of its followers. It just has to convince them they should all be a part. Instead of deriving its ideal from criticism of existing conditions, utopianism plucks its vision ready-made from the creator's own mind, and how to jump from the reality that we all live in to that perfection, even if we're really attracted to it, sometimes is not very clear. There were over 40 different versions of literary utopia that were published between 1700 and 1850, and that's kind of defining the genre narrowly. But the cool stuff, if you ask me, happened in real life, in utopian communities, when people tried to actually put this stuff into practice. So let me tell you about a couple of those. I kind of wish there were pictures. In the wake of the Second Great Awakening, many newly awakened folks decided to set up intentionally designed communities. They were either dissatisfied with the increasing inequality of everyday society, or, as in the case of the early Brook Farm utopians, they were newly wealthy as a result of those transformations, and they were ready to use their money to perfect society. In some of these collectives, members of a community held all of their possessions in common and lived in a self-supporting society, so they made their own clothes, they made their own food, and so on. In others, a joint stock corporation was the financial foundation, and they put their money in together to start with, and then they'd use those resources to set up the community. Many of these utopianist groups at the time believed in millennialism. Millennialism is this notion that the prophesied return of Christ and the beginning of his new age of domination were about to happen, like tomorrow or on the 13th of October or what have you. The Harmony Society made 3 attempts to establish such a millennial society, with the most notable example at New Harmony, Indiana. Later on, the Scottish industrialist Robert Owen bought New Harmony and attempted to form a secular utopian community there. So there's utopias built on top of utopias. The Frenchman Charles Fourier began a similar secular experiment with what he called phalanxes, these buildings in which a bunch of communal members would get together and they would live and they'd divide up their duties and so on and so forth. These were spread across the Midwestern United States. You will note Miles Coverdale makes an ironic reference to phalansteries in the sky very early in the novel. That's what he's imagining, one of these phalanxes as a kind of castle in the sky. The Shakers, you may have heard of, founded by Mother Ann Lee, had 6,000 people in communities from Maine to Kentucky by 1850. The Shakers condemned sexuality. They demanded absolute celibacy. New members could only, therefore, come from conversions, unless something went wrong. The opposite situation could be found in what was called the Perfectionist Movement, led by John Humphrey Noyes. It was founded in 1848. Noyes believed that the act of final conversion, so when you finally actually agree to give your soul to Christ and so on, that meant that you were absolutely and completely released from sin. You could no longer sin after you had given up your soul to God. So, perhaps consequently, the sexual practices, you can kind of imagine with the whole idea of sin removed, things got a little freaky out on the farm. Children were planned and raised communally, so women didn't have to take care of the kids, right? Everybody was taking care of everybody's kids, so the labor was divided up much more evenly than it normally is. Men had to learn to control their emissions during sex. We may have to do some bleeping in this section, dude. They had a special term for this. They called it continence. And that was to avoid unplanned pregnancies, right? Because they're planning out every child as it comes along. So then you can naturally ask yourself, well, how do the dudes learn to control themselves, and how do the ladies learn how to keep from, things getting out of hand? So the way they handled that was they had the old people in the community train the young people how to have sex. That's right.
You know, don't leave too long for that to sink in.
Look, dude. It's like this massive, old, young, horizontal polka dance.
No, stop it. Don't expand on it. Just move on.
Okay. The community prospered. I mean, everybody was pretty happy, I guess. But the real reason they prospered was that despite all of this sex focus, Noyes actually opted for modern manufacturing as the economic basis of it. Eventually, of course, they got a lot of pressure from outside and there were tensions within the community. Eventually, they abandoned the religious stuff and they became a joint stock company. And this is a company that you're still familiar with, perhaps, and that is Oneida. They made, what is it called? Tableware? Right? Forks and knives and spoons and stuff. That was where their factory was. They manufactured this stuff and they were extremely successful. So whenever you have dinner and you're using Oneida flatware, well, just think of continents. Joseph Smith also experienced a religious conversion in this era. Under his guidance, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, commonly referred to as the Mormons, began, and the Mormons traveled west in search of a place to set up their ideal community, and as you know, they found it in Utah. Again, there were sexual innovations here in the form of polygamy and a kind of backward-looking gender hierarchy that was almost the opposite of the people who were following Noyes in the Perfectionist Movement at Oneida. Women were allowed to vote in Utah, though the radicalness of that is kind of diminished when one considers that it was a political ploy to pump up the voting population in Utah so that it could be accepted for statehood more rapidly, and that worked. So Brook Farm, which Hawthorne was a member of, it was a transcendentalist utopia in spirit, but it was a socialist one in form. Hawthorne, like Ralph Waldo Emerson, was himself a Unitarian Universalist. He believed in the universal salvation of humans, he believed in a single God, but he didn't really have much theology other than that. Transcendentalism was built out of the wrangling between different kinds of Protestantism and the German and Vedic philosophies that seeped into American intellectual life in the early 19th century. Let me say just a couple of things about Transcendentalism. Among Transcendentalists' core beliefs was the idea that there was an ideal spiritual state that transcends the physical and the empirical, the world you can sense and feel, and that is only realized through the individual's intuition, rather than through the doctrines of established religions. They also believe in a kind of distributed notion of God, wherein divine power is equally distributed throughout all phenomena. This rat, these flowers, my coffee, my soul, my eyeballs, I guess, continents. All these things contain little tiny parts of the divine, and they're all interconnected in some kind of fundamental way. Kind of atomic level divinity. Emerson calls it the Oversoul. His 1836 essay Nature is usually taken to be the key moment at which Transcendentalism became a major cultural movement. If you look at your next slide, you can see a picture of Ralph Waldo Emerson, our example of Transcendentalism, and an important quote from him that I think summarizes that stance. We will walk with our own feet, we will work with our own hands. A nation of men will for the first time exist because each believes himself inspired by the divine soul, which also inspires all men. You can kind of see how the whole Brook Farm notion would fit in here. This is not the socialism that you hear denigrated in public discourse today. That word gets thrown around a lot, but it's generally used in reactionary, underinformed ways. At Hawthorne's time and in America, socialism was as much an affair of the spirit as it was of politics, and it very often implied fundamentally a kind of hands-on commitment to doing the work of building community. Now, Hawthorne, as you can see from Blithedale Romance, is critical of the utopian ideal. And at the same time, he makes the narrator of the Blithedale Romance, Miles Coverdale, a character who's so unpleasant, in many ways blinded by his own imagination, that it becomes kind of unclear whether we're supposed to be, like, concluding that only a doddering, self-absorbed, snooty bachelor would be cynical about utopias, or whether we're supposed to agree with him and say, oh yeah, those guys are all foolish dreamers. Much of this deliberately constructed ambiguity has to do with a fundamental distaste that Hawthorne had for the "you're with me or you're against me" radical position-taking, the either-or black or white rhetoric of his time. That's a rhetoric that has returned very powerfully in American culture recently, and Hawthorne would be very unhappy with it. The place where he confronted this most immediately was in his literary labors. Though he loved to write didactic stories in the form of parables and allegories, and though he basked in the romantic glow of European styles, as you can kind of see from his language in this book, his was the moment of the rise of serious nationalism in literature, and that nationalism fueled Hawthorne's popularity. So I want to turn for a second from the context of utopianism to the context of nationalism and a kind of patriotism. We talked about this a little bit with the vision of a deep American past in Hobomok, but by the middle of the 1800s, as we were now 30 years later after that book, that experimentation had turned into a full-blown literary movement. Young America in literature. The Young America movement was a political concept that was popular in the 1840s. It was inspired by European youth movements of the decade before. It advocated free trade, social reform, expansion southward into the territories, and support for Republican movements abroad, and that included the revolutions of 1848, for example. It became a faction of the Democratic Party in the 1850s. Take a look at your next slide. Because Young America also had a literary side, Cornelius Matthews adopted the name for the movement, and in a speech here quoted from 1845, he says, "Whatever that past generation of statesmen, lawgivers, and writers was capable of, we know. What they attained, what they failed to attain, we also know. Our duty and our destiny is another from theirs." Liking not at all its borrowed sound, he admits to the fact that they've ripped off this name from, Europe. We are yet, there is no better way to name it, the Young America of the people, a new generation, and it is for us now to inquire what we may have in our power to accomplish, and on what object the world may reasonably ask that we should fix our regard. So this is a kind of, we're going it alone, we're going to be America, and damn the rest of the world, and we're going to start inventing new stuff. That's kind of the attitude of this thing. Now, many of the writers that we associate with what is now called the American Renaissance, that is to say, mid-1800s writers like Hawthorne and Melville, like Whitman and Dickinson, they mocked the Young America literary movement. But at the same time, they were caught up in it. In many cases, the reason for that was because their publishers were interested in the market power of this idea of a Young America in literature, of a movement. And you could sell the latest novel or the latest book of poetry that was the representation of this radical new and innovative movement in American literature. There was a general rage for responding to what was the central literary question of the day, and it was posed most famously in 1820 by a kind of snooty English person named Sidney Smith. This is in your next slide. In the four quarters of the globe, who reads an American book, or goes to an American play, or looks at an American picture or statue? What new constellations have been discovered by the telescopes of Americans? Who drinks out of American glasses or eats from American plates? Smith didn't know what was going to happen in Oneida. Finally, and this is often a part of this quotation that is left off when people are talking about the origins of American literature, but this is very important to remember. Finally, under which of the old tyrannical governments of Europe is every sixth man a slave, whom his fellow creatures may buy and sell and torture? Smith reminds us that what was distinctive about the United States in his time was slavery, not the artistic productions of Americans, and not even their amazing industrial productions. Publishers latched onto the opportunities offered by the invention of the steam press and the power of railroads to expand distribution to the boonies by stamping their literary magazines and books with the rhetoric of American production. Notice, on page 4 of Blithedale, the narrator writes, "This is what the American romancer needs." Even Hawthorne plants his flag in American soil. But notice, he refers to America by name in only one substantial passage after this in the book, and that one is hardly idealistic. It's a reference to the persistence of class tension in America. He had a difficult relationship with this notion that America was the cause, the basis for writing literature. The role of women in this new American literary assertiveness was still controversial. And we've talked about this before in the case of Charlotte Temple and in the case of Hobomok. This is important because, after all, our character Zenobia in Blithedale romance is a writer. Women would write for cheap, and they wrote the kind of thing that other women, increasingly a part of the buying public, wanted to read. So there began to be pressure on the traditional role of men as being the only ones who publish. As we saw in the case of Lydia Maria Child, for example, women were increasingly powerful in the marketplace for fiction. But the larger context of women's experience makes clearer why many of Child's efforts were directed at either domestic advice or at abolitionism, and why Hobomok and Blithedale are such extraordinary works in very different ways during their time. After the American Revolution and the birth of the new republic, American women gained a limited political voice in what was known as Republican motherhood. Under this philosophy, women, as mothers or potential mothers, were seen as the domestic protectors of liberty and republicanism. Mothers were charged with passing down these ideals to their children through instruction, through teaching them at home how to be patriotic, how to feel and think in nationalistic ways. By the turn of the 19th century, the role of women had hardened into what is called the cult of domesticity, or the cult of true womanhood. Middle-class women lost much of their political voice as the political weight of their role was downplayed in favor of home economics and morality. Under the doctrine of two spheres, women were to exist in the domestic sphere at home, while their husbands operated in the public sphere of politics and business and law. Women took on a new role of softening their husbands and instructing their children in piety and not Republican values. The idea was, when dad comes home, if mom has some kind of sense that he's not being a true civic voice, she would kind of ease him into a discussion in which she would persuade him using the female arts that he needed to take a softer position, while men handled the business and financial affairs of the family. Take a look at your next slide. This is a passage from Blithedale Romance where I think you can see some of these tensions over gender roles emerging. Hollingsworth's more than brotherly attendance gave me inexpressible comfort. See, Dan? That's how we're supposed to...
Icky.
It could be a lot worse.
Gross.
Most men, and certainly I could not always claim to be one of the exceptions, have a natural indifference, if not an absolutely hostile feeling toward those whom disease or weakness or calamity of any kind causes to falter and faint amid the rude jostle of our selfish experience. The education of Christianity, it is true, the sympathy of a like experience, and the example of women may soften and possibly subvert this ugly character of our sex. So here we have Coverdale voicing that notion that women act by being an influence, by being a kind of emotional influence on men, rather than being direct. Except in love, or the attachments of kindred, he goes on, or other very long and habitual affection, we really have no tenderness. Dudes, they're just not tender. They can't do it. But there was something of the woman molded into the great stalwart frame of Hollingsworth. Nor was he ashamed of it, as most men are, of what is best in them, nor seemed ever to know that there was such a soft place in his heart. What is the basis of this outrageous split between men and women? One that Hawthorne's Coverdale is here simultaneously promoting, and he promotes when he criticizes Zenobia's gruel, for example. He's like, oh, she's supposed to be a woman, but she can't make breakfast. And criticizes in his assessment of Hollingsworth's femininity here. He's trying, there's an almost kind of superhuman effort to separate out the qualities of the sexes and make them distinct, where in fact they're all combining with each other all the time, even in his own description of himself. Now remember the coverture laws. Those determined in part Charlotte's fate, right? And they're still affecting women in Hawthorne's time. They're still in place. Women still can't control their property once they get married. This ensured that men would hold political power over their wives, because women who were married could not legally control their own property or sign legal documents in their own name. Women resisted the rhetoric that Coverdale uses here. Margaret Fuller, for example, was one such resistor. She was one of the eminent intellectuals of early 19th century America, a notably contentious personality. She was one of Lydia Maria Child's mentors. She was a friend of Waldo Emerson, and she is, of course, in part the inspiration for Zenobia. By the mid-1800s, women associated with the anti-slavery movement began to question their own legal status in the United States as well. Leaders such as Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton broke from the motherhood cult when they organized the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention to call for women's rights. Some of the strongest advocates for abolition were women, both black and white, who saw the legal limits placed on themselves magnified in the case of the loss of personhood in slavery. So a certain amount of this self-consciousness about the competition between men and women in the literary marketplace can be seen in Blithedale. The narrator, after all, is a minor poet, and Zenobia is a well-known magazine writer. So presumably, a minor poet is not making nearly as much money, nor does he have nearly as much fame as somebody in Zenobia's position. Now, in 1855, Hawthorne himself had written a letter to his publisher William Ticknor, angrily lashing out at what he referred to as the damned mob of scribbling women, whose books often sold in the thousands, sometimes the hundreds of thousands, driving other writers out of the literary marketplace, or at least so he saw it. Take a look at your next slide. Here's the quotation from that letter. I mean, it was written on the 19th of January, and it was very, very cold in Massachusetts, so maybe that was part of it. But I don't think there's any reason we need to give him any rope. Besides, he says, America is now wholly given over to a damned mob of scribbling women, and I should have no chance of success. Well, I know, this is ridiculous. There's not much to save this quotation. I'm going to try to do it, but there's no chance of success while the public taste is occupied with their trash, and I should be ashamed of myself if I did succeed. What is the mystery of these innumerable editions of The Lamplighter and other books, neither better nor worse? Worse they could not be, and better they need not be when they sell by 100,000. Sour grapes, anybody?
Wow.
Yeah, I know, dude. It's like, oh, you could have made it a little more accessible. This now often quoted and intemperate private comment was later recuperated and institutionalized as part of a general campaign against 19th century American women writers in particular, and women's writing in general. In effect, critics were like, oh yeah, Hawthorne got it right. He wasn't just being snide and jealous. So the tension between Coverdale and Zenobia reflects an actual contest going on at the time, and one that may seem ridiculous to us looking back on it from a time when, unlike the period we've been studying, women can vote, married women own property, the professions are open to women, and nobody would say that women were being improper or scandalous by becoming writers or, say, winning most of the major prizes. Note, though, that Coverdale is not only wishy-washy, he's hypocritical about women, right? There's that description in the beginning when he first meets Zenobia, right? He comes along and they're talking to each other about the weather. And she makes a reference to how she is not going to, be wearing the garment of nature until spring comes along. And he's like, and he actually stops in his tracks and is like, I pictured her in nature's garment, right? He's thinking of her naked, right? This is not normal stuff for literature of the time. Totally hypocritical, right? He worships her, he denigrates her at the same time. Obviously, he's got a thing for her, right? And then, at the end of the novel, sorry, spoiler alert, the shitty last sentence of this thing is that he says, oh, I'm in fact in love with the even more superficial, right? The empty vessel Priscilla. So Coverdale's defensiveness perhaps conveys to a degree that Hawthorne was in fact torn over this question of whether a writer should try to just create beautiful art or whether he or she should be trying to sell 100,000 copies and art be damned. But James Fields was Ticknor's partner. So they were teamed up to publish Hawthorne's novel. And it was Fields who really scouted Hawthorne initially and tried to get him to commit to writing novels. He saw in Hawthorne a romance writer and a fable writer who would appeal to the masses. And he pushed him to write novels that would appeal to wide audiences while conveying and even kind of representing in his person the whiff of New England aristocracy and history. So when you bought a Hawthorne novel, you were buying an American novel, a high-class novel, and a brush with history. Hawthorne would likely have been just as appalled by George Lepard with his yellowback novels and his criticism of capitalism as he was by the best-selling women writers of his day. Turning again from context to the form and style of this novel.
And action.
We're getting nowhere.
Okay.
Hawthorne's style was neither quite austere nor quite accessible. I think that's the best I can say for it. In fact, it's the space between...
Wow, that was being kind.
It's the space between the definite and the unknown that Hawthorne is working in all the time. The half-known, what he calls the tremulous, he uses that word over and over again in the novel. The suggestive, the flirty, the dark secret half-known behind the socially obvious. Still, as I said, this novel is a little bit uncharacteristic, and I admit I'm throwing it out there because I'm assuming you've read the more obviously historically romancy Scarlet Letter already. Hawthorne usually employs an almost omniscient third-person narrator, but in this book he gives us a character narrator, Miles Coverdale. So take a look at your next slide, and I've tried to schematize here a little bit the aspects of Hawthorne style, like how you know you're reading a Hawthorne sentence or paragraph. So first of all, allegorical character names. You can almost always look back into ancient history or classical Greece and find some basis for his names. And then at another level, there's also the second item here. There's a hint of allegory in the story as a whole. It kind of feels like the story is about something else, really, as you're reading it along. But then, number 3, he undermines every single allegory he sets up. Right? So just when you think, oh, this is actually about Andrew Jackson and the Native Americans, or just when you think, oh, this is actually him kind of alluding to Shakespeare, to Romeo and Juliet, then everything falls apart. He's relentlessly setting things up to make you think that you know what's going on and there's a pattern, and then pulling that away. And so, item number 4, there's a kind of systematic creation of ambiguity. This is not just at the level of the characters or their interactions, but at the level of sentences themselves that seem to completely undermine themselves when you start to think about it, because he's always saying something seems like this, or it appeared that this, or he thought that, but maybe. That's the sentence structure in many cases in Hawthorne's works. Number 5, he has an edgy but not quite gothic weirdness. There's that weird scene when Coverdale gets sick and he goes outside and he sees the cloud coming over, and it's described as if it's kind of ominous and clearly symbolic, and maybe it is, but it's really hard to sort of judge. There's also the scene at the end of The Mask where just out of the blue people appear to be other characters, and Coverdale doesn't tell you that they're people who are dressed up as characters. That kind of edginess and weirdness, very often a characteristic of Hawthorne's works. Item number 6, this is super key. He emphasizes time and history as problems, that there are competing ways of looking at the past, and to a certain extent that the past is controlling us in the present in some way that we maybe don't completely understand. Very characteristic of Hawthorne. There are not quite ghosts coming back, but in, for example, Moody, who is, right, Fauntleroy, this character who is Priscilla's and Zenobia's father, the way in which he comes back sort of later in the book to kind of reveal some of the dynamics that are going on that we haven't known about, and his very distant past. It's implied that he was maybe a forger, and that was the crime that he committed. How that kind of continues to determine the present, right? Zenobia is not quite what she is. Priscilla is definitely not what she seems. They are his children, so on and so forth. That's that kind of thinking about how the past continues to rule our lives in ways that we don't always understand is a theme in Hawthorne. And then last, I'd say there's a kind of very heavy scene setting and character description. So unlike, for example, Susanna Rowson's Charlotte Temple, where we don't even know what Charlotte looks like until halfway through the book, in Hawthorne, often before we even know the name of the character, we've got an extensive description of what they look like, how they move, who they seem like, and again, perhaps maybe they're sort of like something else, that kind of comparison. The same with the settings. You can quite vividly picture Coverdale's room or Zenobia's parlor in the city when he's spying on her out of the back window of his hotel, or you can deeply imagine what Blithedale looks like, for example. That hasn't always been the case in the novels that we've been reading. If you look at the next slide, I'm going to just finish with these two. I made 2 wordles. I was just interested in the kind of relative significance of certain words in this text. Now, in the first one, this is a word frequency analysis of the novel with the characters' names left in. And as you can see, whatever Coverdale may say at the end about how he was in love with Priscilla, Zenobia is the one he's focused on, and the one he's next focused on is Hollingsworth. So if he's got a crush, it's on the dude and on Zenobia, right? And I think, when you take out, so look at the next one, when you take out the character names, something really bizarre and interesting happens, right? First of all, if you look in the middle of it at the biggest term, right, the 2 biggest terms are like and little. Little is the most frequently used word that's not an a, an, or the. They call those stop words. It's the most frequently used term. And maybe this helps explain how we get this impression of Coverdale as a snob. He's belittling everything all the time. Right? Everything is little compared to him. But notice how frequent are Hawthorne's terms that create ambiguity. Look, might is huge. Seemed, like, may, thought, yet. All these terms are rampant. If you add them all together, they constitute a huge portion of the commonly used terms. This book is woven out of uncertainty, even at the most basic stylistic level of word choice. All of this stuff is important in part because the novel is itself about a writer. And to a degree, it's about being a writer. So here's where the track that we've been looking at in terms of context, of what's happening in the literary marketplace and how that's changing, starts to cross into the path of why are writers making the decision that they are making to become a writer, and what does it mean? There are all kinds of different texts within the text in this book. We've got the spirit talking scene with a veiled lady who turns out to be Priscilla. We've got the storytelling scene with Zenobia, where she freaks out Priscilla at the end. We have the bizarre harvest mask scene that I mentioned earlier at the end of the novel, and yet there's no poetry at all. We saw lots of poetry in Charlotte Temple, we saw it in Hobomok, but even though Coverdale is a poet, and even though Zenobia says she sings his poetry and he's going to write the poem right about this group, we get none of it on the page. It seems to me to be implied that this experience with Zenobia drove Coverdale from writing poetry to writing prose. He tells us at the end it's been 10 years since his book of poetry was published. So presumably the very book that we're reading is his next production. A memoir, not a book of poetry.
And action.
The man who claims all along not to be a part of the story ends up telling a version of the story that suggests just how little he knew was going on. Coverdale can't give up two kinds of privilege, his middle-classness and his single manhood, which together leave him free to be critical of everyone, to claim that he's innocent, and to avoid the hard work not just of making one's own bread with one's hands, but the hard work of making a better society for everyone. Now, our next writer, Rebecca Harding Davis, offers a radical contrast with her short novel, some might even call it a short story, Life in the Iron Mills. Published just after the start of the Civil War in 1861, this little story is so different in style and content from Hawthorne that it's hard to believe they came out of the same literary world, hard to believe they were written within just a few years of each other. In part, this has to do with the shift in literary style that was just getting underway at the time. From the romance, mentioned in the Blithedale title, to realism, a mode of writing that would come to dominate the rest of the 19th century. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you, people. I'll see you next time.
And action.
I want to move the rat and see if anybody notices.
And action.
So, what was I saying?
And
Did that rat move?
action.
I might just be hallucinating things. We're getting nowhere. It's like Groundhog Day, that movie. Plus I needed a drink. Fame. Damn it, I gotta start up.
There's a lot of breathing.
You want me to stop breathing? What's wrong with your face? Do I look okay? You know what? I don't give a rat's ass.
That's a rat's ass there.
Do you like my flowers?
Let's move along, because this is a long one.
Do you like my flowers? They were sent to me by an admirer. Well, partly because it's kind of tedious and what's happening? What's wrong? The clanking and the clanking of the balls. Also, Mom's talking to herself out there. We can't have distractions. The only problem is that I don't remember anything I just said. It's
Sorry
good.
to inconvenience you in your own home.
It's good having a director. Like, I often play 3 or 4 of your songs over the course of a semester to introduce a class.
Why aren't we doing that?
Well, that's what I was saying. Like, if we put your music at the end of it, you know what I'm saying? Like you did with the first one. Like, that would be cool. That would be, it's not as cool as like having it playing when they come in.
They're not going to listen to the end. Done saying your last word. They're going to stop it like, oh my God, thank God that is over with.